The slap cracked through a packed emergency room like a gunshot. A billionaire's hand, a nurse's face, blood on her lip. "Know your place," he said. The room went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She pressed a folded cloth to her mouth, picked up her clipboard, and walked back to her patient, a 7-year-old girl coding on a gurney. What Marcus Holt didn't know, what nobody in that hospital knew, was that Emily Carter had once carried wounded commanders through burning enemy wreckage with 3 cracked ribs and a bullet lodged in her left shoulder. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. If this story already has your jaw on the floor, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Emily's story all the way to the end, because what happens next is going to shake you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's get started. The girl's name was Sasha Moreno, and she was 7 years old and she was dying. That was the only thing Emily Carter was thinking about when the double doors blew open at 6:14 in the evening and Marcus Holt walked into the emergency department of Rivergate Regional Medical Center like he owned the floor beneath his shoes. He probably thought he did. Men like Holt tended to think that about most surfaces. Emily was at the central station charting Sasha's latest vitals when she heard the commotion. She didn't look up immediately. The ER at Rivergate was rarely quiet. She had learned, in her 8 months working this floor, to filter noise by category. Raised voices near triage meant intake problems. Alarms from Bay 4 meant the defibrillator cart needed a battery check again. The particular quality of silence that followed a loud entrance, that specific sucked-in quiet, meant someone important had just decided to make themselves known. She looked up. Marcus Holt was 53 years old, 6'2", and built like a man who had spent money on his body the same way he spent it on everything else, decisively and without restraint. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent, and he had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since curdled into something harder. Beside him walked his son, Bryce, 22, pale, sweating through his shirt collar, cradling his right arm against his chest. "Someone help him," Holt said. Not a request. A declaration. The intake nurse, a woman named Doris who had been working this desk for 11 years and had seen everything twice, looked up from her screen. "Sir, I'll need you to fill out an intake form and we'll triage your son based on—" "He's in pain," Holt said. "Get him a room. We have a full board right now. I can get him seen as soon as—" "Do you know who I am?" Doris did not blink. "I need your son's name and date of birth, sir." Emily had already returned to her chart. She heard this conversation the same way she heard rain. Background information, present but not requiring action. Sasha Moreno's oxygen saturation had dipped to 91% in the last reading, and the attending, Dr. Ferris, was stuck in Bay 3 with a septic patient. Emily had already called for a respiratory consult and was cross-referencing the girl's history for any contraindications to the bronchodilator she suspected they were going to need. She was halfway through the chart when she heard footsteps stop beside her. "You," Holt's voice close now. "I need my son in a room." Emily finished the note she was writing before she looked up. "Bay assignments go through triage. The nurse at the front desk can—" "I didn't ask about the process. I asked you to put my son in a room." She looked at him directly. "Your son will be seen. We have a critical patient ahead of him right now." "Critical." Holt said the word like it was an excuse. "Everything's critical. That's how you people justify making everyone wait." He glanced past her toward the bays. "Which one? Which room is this critical patient in?" "I'm not going to tell you that. Bryce has a possible fracture. He's been waiting 20 minutes. "I understand that's frustrating," Emily said. "He will be seen. Right now, the child ahead of him is on supplemental oxygen with a dropping SAT level, and I need to get back to her chart." Something shifted in Holt's face. Not anger exactly. It was more like the specific irritation of a man who had never once in his adult life been told to wait, encountering the concept for the first time and finding it physically offensive. "Get me your supervisor," he said. "Charge nurse is Deb Nguyen. She's in Bay 3. Emily turned back to her screen. That was when it happened. She didn't see the hand coming. She heard it. the sharp split-second displacement of air, and then the impact registered across the left side of her face, and she was gripping the counter's edge, and there was a hot, wet pressure at the corner of her mouth where her teeth had caught her lip. The emergency department went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The particular silence of 30 people processing something that should not have happened, and did. Emily stood perfectly still. Her pulse had jumped exactly once. She was aware of it, the way she had trained herself to be aware of it, the spike and the immediate controlled descent. Her left hand, pressed flat against the counter, was steady. She tasted copper. She pressed 2 fingers to her lip, checked them. Small amount of blood, surface laceration, nothing structural. She turned around. Holt was already pulling back, adjusting his jacket. His expression had shifted into something complicated. Not remorse, not exactly, but the look of a man recalculating whether he had gone further than was strategically useful. "Know your place," he said. Quieter this time. Like that made it better. Bryce, behind him, looked like he wanted to be somewhere else entirely. He had gone a shade paler, if that was possible. Emily looked at Holt for a moment. Then she picked up her clipboard, pressed the cloth she'd been using for Sasha's chart work to her lip, and walked into Bay 6. Behind her, the ER came back to life in fragments. A tech named Ronaldo had his phone out, but wasn't sure if he'd actually caught it. Doris had already picked up the desk phone. 2 nurses near the medication cart were whispering. Holt was telling someone, his lawyer probably, that she had provoked him, that there were witnesses, that this was going to be handled. Nobody stopped him from talking. In Bay 6, Emily stood at Sasha Moreno's bedside and checked the oxygen monitor and looked at this small girl with her dark curly hair matted against the pillow and her chest moving with too much effort for someone her age. Sasha's mother, a woman named Rosa, sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her daughter, the way a person watches something they are terrified of losing. "How is she?" Rosa asked. "Her oxygen is a little low. We're adjusting her support right now." Emily kept her voice level. "Dr. Ferris is going to come take a look within the next few minutes." Rosa nodded. She glanced at Emily's face, at the cloth pressed to her lip, and seemed to want to say something, and didn't. Emily made the note in the chart. Then she stepped out of the bay, walked to the small supply closet at the end of the corridor, and closed the door behind her. She stood in the dark for approximately 45 seconds. Then she took her personal cell phone out of her scrub pocket and dialed a number she hadn't dialed in nearly 4 years. It rang twice. "Kellerman?" said the voice on the other end. Clipped, immediate. The voice of a man who answered every call ready to move. "It's Carter," she said. "I need to give you a code." A pause. Not confusion, recognition, the kind of pause that comes before someone shifts gears. "Go ahead." She gave him the code. 11 digits, a sequence she had memorized in a different life, in a different country, under circumstances that would sound like fiction to every person currently standing in the emergency department outside this supply closet door. Another pause. Longer this time. "Emily." His voice had changed slightly. "Are you safe?" "I'm fine, but I need you to know something has happened, and I need someone to know it officially." She paused. "That's all I'm asking for right now." "Where are you?" "Rivergate Regional, Nashville." A third pause. She heard what sounded like papers moving, or maybe a chair. "I'll make some calls." "That's all I'm asking." She hung up. She stood in the dark supply closet for another few seconds, then opened the door and walked back to the station, because Sasha Moreno's oxygen level wasn't going to manage itself. What Emily Carter had not said to Kellerman, and what he already knew because men like Kellerman made it their business to know, was that she hadn't simply served in the Marine Corps. She had spent 11 years as a forward-deployed combat medic in environments most military personnel never saw, attached to units whose names didn't appear in public records. She had completed 3 tours in active combat zones and 1 in a location that still didn't officially exist on any Department of Defense document. She had been awarded the Navy Cross, quietly, in a ceremony with no press presence and an attendance list that had since been classified. for an action in which she had entered a burning vehicle convoy under direct fire and extracted 4 wounded officers, one of whom had been Colonel James Kellerman before he became General James Kellerman. She had left the Corps at 34 because her left knee had finally decided it was done absorbing the punishment she'd been asking it to absorb. And because she had, after a decade of watching people die in difficult places, wanted to try saving them in easier ones. She had become a nurse. She had not told her colleagues this history, not because she was ashamed of it, she wasn't, but because it wasn't relevant. In the ER, what was relevant was your scope of practice, your response time, and whether you could hold a vein when the patient was moving. She had demonstrated all 3. That was enough. Dr. Ferris finally reached Bay 6 at 6:41 p.m. He was a compact man with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at Sasha, looked at the chart, looked at Emily's face, specifically at the bruise already forming along her jaw, and said, "Someone told me what happened out there. The patient needs a bronchodilator and possibly a CPAP consult," Emily said. Ferris looked at her a moment longer than was necessary, then turned to Sasha's chart. "Walk me through her last 3 readings." She did. They were in the middle of adjusting the treatment plan when Deb Nguyen appeared in the bay doorway. Deb was the charge nurse, 61 years old, former Army, unimpressed by everything. She looked at Emily with an expression that had collapsed several emotions into one efficient package. "Administration wants to talk to you," Deb said. "Holt's lawyer is already on the phone with Garfield." Garfield was the hospital's chief operating officer, a man Emily had met twice and found both times to be primarily concerned with the hospital's liability exposure. "They're saying you were insubordinate and that you obstructed a patient's access to care." Emily did not look up from the chart. "Sasha's SAT is coming up. We're at 93. Emily, "I heard you. I'll go when Dr. Ferris doesn't need me here." Deb looked at Ferris. Ferris said, without looking up, "Give us 10 minutes. Deb left. Sasha looked at Emily with the particular solemn attention of a sick child who has been around hospitals long enough to understand that the adults are worried. "Does your face hurt?" she asked. "Little bit," Emily said. "My face hurt when I fell off my bike," Sasha said. "My mom put ice on it." "That's good advice." Emily adjusted the oxygen clip on the girl's finger. "How does it feel in your chest right now? Better or the same?" Sasha considered this with great seriousness. "Maybe a little better." "Good." Rosa was watching Emily with the kind of careful attention mothers develop when they've spent too many nights in hospital chairs. "You should report him," she said quietly. "What he did." "There's a process for that," Emily said. "That's not an answer." Emily smiled despite herself, which pulled at the cut on her lip, which she ignored. "No," she said. "I guess it's not." The meeting with administration happened at 7:20 p.m. in a conference room on the second floor. Emily sat across from COO Gerald Garfield, a man in his late 50s with the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent decades managing other people's crises. Beside him sat the hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Ames who had a yellow legal pad and a pen she kept clicking. On the other side of the table, via speakerphone, was a voice Emily didn't recognize that introduced itself as representing Holt Meridian Defense Corporation. "We want to be clear," the voice said, "that this situation can be resolved without further escalation. Mr. Holt deeply regrets any misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," Emily said. Garfield cleared his throat. "Emily, we'd like to—" He struck me. "That's not a category of event that contains misunderstandings." Patricia Ames stopped clicking her pen. The voice on the speakerphone shifted register slightly. Not quite backpedaling, but recalibrating. "Mr. Holt acknowledges that emotions ran high. His son was in considerable pain, and he acted out of parental concern. He acted out of the belief that I was a person he could hit," Emily said. "Those are different things." Garfield leaned forward. "Emily, I want you to understand that the hospital values what you do here, and we're going to take all the appropriate steps." "What steps?" she said. Silence. "What are the appropriate steps, Gerald? Because I want to know, specifically, what is going to happen." Garfield looked at Patricia, Patricia looked at her yellow legal pad. The voice on the speakerphone was quiet in the particular way of someone who has muted themselves to speak to someone else. "We're going to conduct a full review," Garfield said. "In the meantime, it might be best if you took a few days of administrative leave while we—" "No," Emily said. "Emily, I'll finish my shift." She looked at him with the kind of steadiness that comes not from anger, but from the absence of fear. "Whatever review you want to conduct, conduct it. But I'm going back downstairs to my patients." She stood up. "If you walk out of this room," the voice on the speakerphone said, and there was something in the tone now, something that had decided to stop pretending. "There will be legal consequences for this hospital that—" Emily picked up her badge from the table where she'd set it. "File whatever you want." She left the room. In the elevator going back down, she pressed 2 fingers against the bruise on her jaw, felt its dimensions. It would be significant by morning, purple and yellow, the kind of mark that photographs clearly, and thought about the phone call she'd made in the supply closet. She thought about Kellerman's voice when she'd given him the code. She thought about the fact that in 30 years of knowing the man, she had never once heard him sound surprised, and tonight he had, briefly, sounded very surprised. The elevator opened on the emergency department floor. Emily walked back to the central station, pulled up Sasha Moreno's chart, and checked her most recent oxygen reading. 96%. Better. She exhaled quietly and reached for the next chart in the queue. It was almost 8 p.m. in Nashville, Tennessee, and somewhere across the city, in an office building that had its own security detail and its own power grid and its own set of rules about who could enter and who couldn't, a man named Marcus Holt was telling his lawyers that this would be settled by Thursday and that the nurse wasn't going to be a problem. He had no way of knowing that 1,400 miles away, in a house in Arlington, Virginia, General James Kellerman was already on his second call of the evening, and that the man he was speaking to had 3 stars on his collar, and a memory for operational detail that had never once failed him in 41 years of service. He had no way of knowing that a third call was already being placed, this one to a retired officer in San Antonio who had not spoken to Kellerman in 8 months, and who, upon hearing the name Emily Carter spoken in the context that Kellerman spoke it, went very quiet and then said, "Tell me where she is." Marcus Holt sat in his lawyer's office and believed he had humiliated an ordinary nurse. On the pediatric floor of Rivergate Regional Medical Center, Sasha Moreno was breathing easier, and her mother had finally unclenched her hands from each other, and a night shift tech was bringing her a cup of ice chips. And in the supply closet, where Emily had made the only phone call she was going to make tonight, the shelf she had gripped while she gathered herself still held the faint impression of her fingers against its dusty edge. The only evidence that for 45 seconds, in the dark, the former Marine who had carried commanders through enemy fire had stood completely still and allowed herself, just briefly, to feel the full weight of what had been done to her. Then she had let it go and gone back to work. The night shift at Rivergate Regional moved the way all night shifts moved. Not slower exactly, but differently, the way a river moves differently after the sun goes down. The same current, but under changed light, with changed sounds, everything slightly more exposed. Emily worked through it. She had 3 patients in rotation by 9 o'clock. Sasha Moreno, still in Bay 6, stable now but requiring monitoring through the night. A 47-year-old construction worker named Dale Pruitt, who had come in with a possible MYE and turned out to have esophageal spasm and extreme acid reflux, and was annoyed about both diagnoses. And an elderly woman named Margaret Voss, who had fallen in her bathroom and fractured her wrist and kept apologizing to everyone who came near her, as if the fracture were an inconvenience she had imposed on the staff personally. Emily liked Margaret immediately. The bruise on Emily's jaw had darkened by 10 o'clock. She could feel it when she turned her head too quickly. A dull, persistent throb at the hinge of her jaw. Not severe, but present in the way that certain injuries insist on being acknowledged, even when you'd prefer to ignore them. Ronaldo, the tech, had offered her an ice pack twice. She'd accepted it the second time, held it there for 8 minutes while charting, then set it aside when she needed both hands. Deb came by at 10:30, stood at the station without sitting down, and said, "Garfield called again." Emily didn't look up. "And?" "He wants you to reconsider the leave. He's framing it as for your own benefit, recovery time, that kind of language." "I heard him the first time." Emily. Deb's voice had a particular register she used when she was trying to communicate something important without saying it directly, a skill she had developed over decades in institutional environments. The lawyer on that call tonight was not a personal injury guy. I looked up the firm. They do corporate defense, federal contract litigation. That's not the kind of legal representation someone brings in because a nurse got slapped. Emily stopped typing. She looked at Deb. What are you saying? I'm saying Marcus Holt didn't call a slip-and-fall lawyer. He called the kind of lawyers who make problems disappear before they become problems. Deb held her gaze. I'm saying whoever you called earlier, and I'm not asking who, I hope they're the kind of people who move faster than corporate attorneys. Emily looked at her for a moment. Go home, Deb. Your shift ended an hour ago. I'm aware of that. Then go home. Deb picked up her bag from under the station counter, slung it over her shoulder, and paused. You know what I noticed about you when you started here? 8 months ago. You know what I thought? I'm sure you're going to tell me. I thought, this woman has been somewhere I haven't been. And whatever it did to her, it didn't break her. It just made her quieter. She tapped the counter once with 2 fingers. Don't let them make it so the quiet was for nothing. She left. Emily sat with that for a moment, then turned back to her screen. At 11:47 p.m., a man in a gray suit appeared at the ER entrance and asked for Emily Carter at the triage desk. He was not a lawyer. Emily knew that the moment Doris flagged her, because lawyers, in her experience, arrived with purpose and a certain choreographed authority, like actors who'd been briefed on their role. This man arrived the way field operatives arrived, moving slightly before he needed to, scanning entry points before he'd finished scanning faces, his suit expensive enough to pass in most contexts, but cut for ease of movement rather than impression. She met him in the corridor near the supply closet, which seemed, at this point, to be developing a certain narrative significance in her life. Ms. Carter, he said. You don't work for Kellerman, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. No, I work for an office that General Kellerman contacted this evening. My name is Farrow. I'm not going to show you a badge because the kind I carry tends to make people nervous in civilian settings. What office? The kind with no sign on the door. She looked at him steadily. Okay. The code you used tonight, we hadn't heard that sequence activated in a long time. There are protocols attached to it. General Kellerman followed them. He paused. He also asked me to tell you personally, and I'm quoting him here, that he and 2 colleagues are getting on a plane in the morning. Emily felt something shift in her chest, small and complicated. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of a door she hadn't known was closed swinging open a few inches. He doesn't need to do that. He said you'd say that. He also said to tell you that he's not doing it for you. He's doing it because the man who hit you is a name that's come up in 6 separate federal investigations over the past 3 years, and tonight gave someone the specific reason they needed to stop filing and start moving. Farrow's voice remained level throughout this, which told her something about the kind of work he did. Marcus Holt has been insulated by money, political connections, and a very careful legal architecture for a long time. What he did tonight in a public emergency room, in front of 30 witnesses, with at least 1 phone camera pointed at his face, that changed the architecture. Emily processed this. How much do you know about him? Enough to have a file. The file has subsections. He paused. Holt Meridian Defense Corporation has held federal military contracts worth approximately $4.3 billion over the past decade. Inspector General referrals going back 7 years. Materials substitution fraud. Equipment submitted as meeting spec that didn't. Delivery falsification. Kickback structures involving 3 separate procurement officers, 2 of whom have since retired. He stopped. 1 of whom didn't. She understood what that meant. She didn't ask him to clarify. Tonight, Farrow said, gave the people who've been building those cases a public event with a name attached and a timestamp. Holt made himself visible when he couldn't afford to be visible. He looked at the bruise on her jaw with the specific expression of someone cataloging it rather than reacting to it. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Did you know who he was when you refused him? I knew his name from the intake board, Emily said. I didn't know his file. I knew he had a son with a possible fracture and that I had a 7-year-old with a dropping oxygen sat, and those two facts existed in a specific order of priority. Pharaoh nodded slowly. Good. That's that's good. It means tonight was clean. No prior knowledge, no setup, just a man who made a choice in public that he can't unmake. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card. Plain, white, nothing on it but a phone number. If anyone contacts you before tomorrow morning, lawyers, administrators, anyone presenting themselves as wanting to help, call this number first. Emily took the card. And if administration tries to suspend me before morning, let them try, Pharaoh said. The optics of suspending an assault victim would accelerate our timeline considerably. He left the way he'd come in, moving slightly ahead of his footsteps, scanning exits. Emily stood in the corridor for a moment, then went back to check on Margaret Voss, who had finally fallen asleep with her fractured wrist wrapped and elevated and a thin blanket pulled up to her chin, looking improbably peaceful for a woman in a hospital at midnight. The hospital's administrative machine began moving against Emily at 7:15 the following morning. She had expected it. Not the specific shape of it. The shape turned out to be a formal written notice slipped under the door of the break room where she was finishing the last 20 minutes of her shift with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. But the general fact of it, yes. Garfield had been telegraphing the direction all night. The notice used the phrase administrative leave pending investigation 3 times in 4 paragraphs. It cited a pattern of behavioral concerns that Emily found interesting, since she had been at Rivergate for 8 months and had not, to her knowledge, generated a single formal complaint, and since the only behavioral incident on record was one in which a billionaire had hit her. The notice did not mention Marcus Holt. It mentioned, with careful vagueness, a recent interaction with a patient family member, and failure to follow established de-escalation protocols. She read it twice, then she photographed it with her phone, sent the image to the number on Pharaoh's card, and finished her coffee. Ronaldo came in at 7:20 to start his day shift, stopped when he saw her face. The bruise had gone fully purple overnight, spreading from her jaw up toward her cheekbone, and said, "Jesus, that looks bad." "It looks worse than it feels," Emily said, which was partially true. "There are people talking," Ronaldo said. He was 26, good at his job, and had the specific moral discomfort of someone who had witnessed something wrong and wasn't sure yet what his role in addressing it was supposed to be. In the department, a lot of people. Talking about what? About what happened, about the video. He hesitated. "There's a video, Emily. Somebody got it on their phone. I don't know how long it's been up, but when I checked this morning, it had like 40,000 views." She set her coffee cup down. "Which part?" "All of it. The slap, you walking away, you going back to your patient, all of it." He pulled out his phone, held it toward her. She looked at the screen without touching it. The footage was shaky. Phone video always was. But the impact was visible. The recoil of her head, the pause, the controlled way she turned and moved toward Bay 6. Someone had added no caption to it, no text overlay. They'd just posted the raw footage with a single line. This happened tonight in an ER in Nashville. She went straight back to her patient. The number under that line, which had presumably been 40,000 when Ronaldo checked it, was now reading considerably higher. Emily handed the phone back. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" Ronaldo looked at her with an expression caught somewhere between admiration and concern. "That's all you've got?" "What would you like me to say, Ronaldo?" "I don't know, something. You got hit by a..." He lowered his voice, though they were alone in the break room. "By a billionaire in the middle of the ER, and you just went back to work and now it's all over the internet and they're trying to put you on leave and..." "Go check on Sasha Moreno," Emily said. "Bay 6. Her sat was 96 when I handed off to the overnight team. Check it again and make sure she ate breakfast." Ronaldo opened his mouth, closed it. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." He left. Emily sat with the cold coffee for another 2 minutes, then picked up her bag and walked out of the break room and down the main corridor and out the hospital's side entrance into the parking lot, where the morning was doing what Nashville mornings did in early April, lukewarm, the sky a pale gray that couldn't decide whether it wanted to become overcast or burn off into something brighter. She sat in her car and pulled out her personal phone. Kellerman had texted at 5:43 a.m. 3 words, wheels up, ETA 1100. She stared at the text for a moment, then put the phone in her bag and started the car. Oh, so. Marcus Holt's morning was not going well, and he was the kind of man who took his bad mornings personally. He had been at his attorney's office since 7, the corporate office, not the criminal defense suite, a distinction that had until recently seemed irrelevant and was beginning to seem less so. And the conversation had been circling the same territory for over an hour. The video was the center of it. The video and the comment section beneath the video, which his communications team had been monitoring since 2 in the morning, and which had, in their assessment, moved beyond manageable. "Take it down," Holt said. "We can't take it down. We didn't post it, and any takedown request we file is going to look like suppression, which is going to generate coverage that makes the video itself look mild by comparison." "Then pay someone to." Marcus, his lead attorney, a woman named Sylvia Pratt, who had been doing this for 28 years and had seen men like Holt make this mistake before, set her pen down on the table. "The video is secondary. I need you to hear me say this clearly. The video is not your problem. Your problem is what the video is attached to." Holt looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means I've been getting calls since 6 this morning from contacts in Washington who are telling me that your name surfaced in a briefing yesterday evening that had nothing to do with what happened at that hospital." She held his gaze. "Nothing to do with it directly, but the timing is not something I can counsel you to dismiss." Holt sat back. The particular stillness that came over him was not calm. It was the stillness of a man who had learned to perform calm as a strategic position and was currently doing so with considerable effort. "What contacts?" "IG adjacent, DOD adjacent." She picked her pen back up. "I don't have specifics yet, but I have enough to tell you that if there are any aspects of Meridian's federal contracts that you have not told me about, aspects that an external review might find worth examining, now is the time." The room was quiet for a moment. "I want to know who she is," Holt said. "The nurse?" "Yes, Emily Carter. I want to know her background. I want to know if there are disciplinary records. I want to know if there's anything we can use to establish that the hospital's administration was right to put her on leave." Pratt wrote something on her legal pad, though her expression suggested she thought this was a poor use of their current resources. "I'll have someone pull her personnel file. And I want someone at that hospital today, someone from our side. I want to know exactly what the administration is willing to do and what they need from us to do it." "Marcus, someone hit me first," he said. "The whole context of what happened is wrong. She was obstructing my son's care, and she became physical, and I reacted." 30 people saw it happen, Pratt said. "And there is video." He stopped talking. She looked at him with the expression of someone choosing words with great care. "My advice, my strong advice, is that you stop talking about last night entirely, and that we focus on getting ahead of whatever is moving in Washington, because that is where the actual danger is." She tapped the legal pad once. "The nurse is a distraction. Whoever she is, she's a distraction. We need to focus." At 10:20 a.m., Emily was back in her apartment, which was on the 3rd floor of a building in East Nashville, and was notable primarily for its complete absence of anything decorative. She had always been uncomfortable with decorative objects. They seemed to her to require a kind of settled certainty about where you were going to be and for how long, and she had spent too many years living out of kit bags to develop that certainty. There was furniture, there were books, military history, emergency medicine, one shelf of fiction she'd been working through slowly. There was a good coffee maker and a pull-up bar mounted in the bedroom doorway, and a set of maps on the kitchen table from a project she'd abandoned 6 weeks ago. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and her phone when it rang. Unknown number. She answered anyway. "Emily Carter?" The voice was female, mid-40s, brisk with the specific briskness of someone who conducts a lot of telephone calls. "My name is Diane Lords. I'm a reporter with the Nashville Herald. I'd like to... How did you get this number?" "I'd like to talk to you about what happened at Rivergate Regional last night." "I'm not going to talk to a reporter," Emily said.
I understand your hesitation. I want to tell you that I'm not interested in a gotcha story. I'm interested in Ms. Lords, the larger context, specifically because I've been working on something adjacent to Marcus Holt for about 4 months, and what happened last night has made Ms. Lords. Emily kept her voice even. I'm not going to talk to you today. If that changes, I'll find a way to reach you. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. 4 months.
The reporter had been working on something adjacent to Holt for 4 months. That was before last night, before the video, before Pharaoh's visit in the corridor. That was background work, the kind of work reporters did when they thought they had something but couldn't prove it yet. She thought about what Pharaoh had said. Holt made himself visible when he couldn't afford to be visible. She thought about the file with subsections, the 7-year IG referral trail, the procurement officers, the one who hadn't retired. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized now as Kellerman's field issue cell. On the ground. Rental car. 45 minutes out. She put down the coffee cup and went to change out of her scrubs. She met them in the parking lot of a Waffle House on the edge of downtown, which was either a very intentional choice or an accidentally perfect one, and knowing Kellerman, probably both. He was standing beside a black SUV when she pulled in, and he looked, well, there was no other word for it, exactly the same as he had looked the last time she'd seen him, which was 4 years ago at a ceremony that didn't officially happen, which meant he looked older than she remembered and younger than he should, the way career military men sometimes did, their faces worn but their bearing unchanged. With him were 2 men she recognized from a distance before she saw their faces. Colonel Abe Wentworth, now retired General Wentworth, who had been the officer she'd pulled out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar province on a Tuesday afternoon in a different life. And behind him, heavier now, the same narrow, watchful eyes, General Patrick Strum, who had been Kellerman's superior during the final deployment and who had made his career in operations and intelligence before transitioning, as many of them did, into the particular gray zone of post-service federal advisory work. 3 retired generals in a Waffle House parking lot in Nashville. Kellerman crossed toward her and stopped about 2 feet away, looking at her face, at the bruise. "Show me," he said. "It's just a bruise, James." "Show me." She turned her face slightly so the light hit it. He looked at it for 3 seconds, which was how Kellerman looked at most things, not lingering, just thorough. Then he nodded once and stepped back. "He hit you in an emergency room," Wentworth said. Not a question. Something else. "In front of 30 people and at least 1 phone camera, yes." "Stupid," Strom said. He said it the way an engineer says a structure has failed. Clinical, final, no heat in it. "Come inside," Kellerman said. "We need to tell you what we found." They sat in a corner booth and the waitress came and Kellerman ordered coffee without looking at the menu, which was the same thing he always did in every situation. And when the waitress had gone, he folded his hands on the table and looked at Emily. "The code you used," he said, "it's attached to a network. You know that." "I know." "When it activates, it generates automatic flags in 3 separate systems. One of those systems is an IG tracking database that has Marcus Holt's name on a watch list." He paused. "It generated a flag at 8:04 p.m. last night. By 9 p.m., there were 4 people in Washington who knew a protected contact had invoked emergency protocol in a location associated with Holt." Emily looked at him. "I didn't know it would do that." "I know you didn't, but it did. And those 4 people made calls." He unfolded his hands. "Marcus Holt is not just a man who built a defense company and got greedy. He built a system, procurement officers, contract reviewers, 2 people on Senate Armed Services subcommittees. He has been running a corruption network inside federal military procurement for at least 9 years. We know this. The IG knows this. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit knows this. What none of them had was a detonator." Emily was quiet. "The video," Strom said. "It had 800,000 views by 8 this morning. By now it's got more. The comment sections are already pulling up Holt's name, his company, the contract history. The internet is doing the work." He sounded neither approving nor disapproving of this fact, merely observational. The narrative has moved out of his control. His lawyers are reactive now, not offensive. Every hour they spend managing the public response is an hour they're not managing the federal one. There's going to be a raid, Wentworth said. Emily looked at him. On Meridian's Nashville headquarters. On their server infrastructure, IG and FBI joint operation. The authorization paperwork has been in process for months. What was missing was a public moment, a clean, documented moment that made the cost of inaction higher than the cost of action. He picked up his coffee. You gave them that moment. I didn't give anyone anything, Emily said. I told a man he had to wait. Yeah, Kellerman said. You did. The table was quiet for a moment. What do you need from us? Emily said. We're going to the hospital, Kellerman said. All three of us. James, you were assaulted in a public medical facility by a man who then attempted to use his money to have you removed from your job. He looked at her without wavering. We're going to the hospital because you deserve to have people in your corner who aren't afraid of him, and because it will make visible to every administrator in that building exactly what they are choosing between. He picked up his coffee. And because Abe cried in a burning truck cab in Kandahar while you were dragging him out of it, and I promised him I'd never let him forget that. Wentworth, across the table, said without expression, I was not crying. You were absolutely crying. I had smoke in my eyes. Emily looked at these three men, these difficult, complicated, decorated men who had made their careers in places most people would never see, and who had arrived in a Waffle House parking lot in Nashville because a nurse with a bruised jaw had dialed an 11-digit code in a supply closet, and felt something that she would not have been able to name cleanly if someone had asked her to. She didn't try to name it. Okay, she said. Good, Kellerman said. We need to be at that hospital by 1. He signaled the waitress for a refill, and outside the window, the Nashville morning had finally made its decision about the sky and chosen brightness. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a conference room on an upper floor of a building with its own security detail, a lawyer was reading something on a laptop screen and had gone very quiet in the specific way that people went quiet when a situation they thought they were managing revealed that it had, in fact, been managing them. The refill came. Kellerman wrapped both hands around the mug and did not look up from whatever he was thinking about. And Emily Carter, who had learned a long time ago in difficult places that the stillness before movement was often the loudest part, sat across from the three men who were about to walk into a hospital and change everything about the next 48 hours, and waited for 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock came and went while they were still in the parking lot, because Strom had received a call at 12:47 that made him step away from the SUV and walk to the far edge of the lot with his back to them. And because the call lasted 11 minutes, and because when he came back, his face had the specific quality of a man who has just received information that changed the shape of the afternoon. They moved the timeline, he said. Kellerman looked at him. How much? The authorization cleared an hour ago. They're not waiting until tomorrow. Strom glanced at Emily, then back at Kellerman. The raid is today, this afternoon. They want bodies at Meridian's Nashville office by 4 o'clock. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then we go now, Kellerman said. They took both vehicles, Emily's car and the rental SUV, and reached Rivergate Regional at 1:23 p.m., which meant the parking lot was in its early afternoon configuration, sparse near the entrance, crowded toward the back, the particular dead hour between lunch and the late afternoon intake surge. Emily pulled into a spot near the side entrance and sat for a moment watching the building's face. She had worked in that building for 8 months. She had learned its rhythms and its moods, and its specific failure points the way you learned any environment you spent enough time in, not academically, but somatically, in the body. She knew which elevator ran slow. She knew that the medication dispensary in Bay 4 jammed if you didn't lift the handle slightly before entering your PIN. She knew that Doris at intake had a bad knee that got worse by Thursday, and that by Friday, she was compensating with her gait in a way that made her slow on lateral movement. She knew this building. She got out of the car. They entered through the main lobby, which meant passing through the atrium with its pale tile floors and its overhead lighting and its information desk staffed by a volunteer named Herbert, who who was 81 years old and profoundly committed to his role. Herbert looked up when the four of them came through the automatic doors and registered, in sequence, Emily. Recognized, filed, 3 men in what appeared to be dress uniforms, not registered, because Herbert's experience of military dress uniforms was limited and his processing of unexpected information was slow. By the time Herbert had finished processing, they were already past the information desk. Emily had not warned anyone they were coming. She had considered it and decided against it, because forewarning an institution gave the institution time to prepare a response, and a prepared institutional response was almost always a managed one, and managed was not what she needed this afternoon to be. The ER was at medium volume. She could hear it before they pushed through the double doors. The specific acoustic signature of controlled urgency, monitors and voices, and the roll of equipment carts on linoleum. She pushed through the doors, and the department opened up in front of her, and for a moment, just a moment, the normal activity continued. A tech moving between bays, a nurse at the central station with her back turned, the PA system delivering a low-volume overhead page. Then Ronaldo looked up from the medication cart. He saw Emily first, then the 3 men behind her in their dress uniforms, and their combined 8 decades of military service, and their collective bearing that was not aggressive and not theatrical, but simply, unmistakably, the bearing of people who occupied space differently than civilians did. Ronaldo's mouth opened. He didn't say anything. The nurse at the central station turned. It was a woman named Carly who had been at Rivergate for 3 years and who had spent most of last night's shift watching the video on her phone between patient checks. And she stopped moving. Someone in Bay 2 said something to someone else, and then that stopped too. The department did not go silent all at once. It went silent in pieces, bay by bay, the way a wave moves backward, each section registering the presence of something that didn't belong and adjusting accordingly. Kellerman, Wentworth, and Strom walked through the emergency department in full dress uniform and stopped at the central station. Kellerman looked at the room, at the nurses and techs and the attending physician who had just emerged from Bay 3 with a chart in his hand and stopped in the doorway, at the faces turned toward them with the specific combination of confusion and attention that occurred when people encountered something outside their established pattern of normal. He looked at Emily. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned to face the room. "My name is General James Kellerman, United States Marine Corps, retired." His voice was not loud, but it had the quality of a voice that had spent decades projecting across difficult terrain, and it reached every corner of the department without effort. "These are General Abe Wentworth and General Patrick Strom. We are here because of what happened in this room last night." Nobody moved. 22 years ago, in a combat zone, a medic ran into a burning vehicle convoy while everyone around her was doing the operationally correct thing, which was taking cover. He paused, not for effect, Emily thought, but because he was a man who paused when the words required it. "She pulled 3 of us out. She did it with a cracked rib and a 9mm round lodged in her left shoulder that she had not told anyone about because she didn't want to be pulled from the field." Another pause. "Last night, someone in this building struck that medic across the face. We're here because we felt that required a response in person." He looked at Emily. All 3 of them looked at Emily. And then, in a gesture that was not theatrical, Emily knew theatrical, she had seen theatrical, this was not that, all 3 of them came to attention and saluted. The department held its breath. Carly, at the central station, put her hand over her mouth. Not crying, just containing something. Dr. Ferris, who had come out of Bay 1 at some point during Kellerman's address and was standing near the wall, looked at Emily with an expression that cycled through several stages before settling into something that resembled shame, and not the comfortable kind. Emily stood in the middle of the emergency department she had worked in for 8 months, with a bruise darkening across the left side of her jaw, and looked at these 3 men who had gotten on planes because she had dialed 11 digits in a supply closet and felt absolutely nothing that she was prepared to feel in public. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. It was all she could manage, and it was enough. Wentworth dropped the salute first and turned to the room the way a man turns to a room he intends to address. "If anyone in this department has questions about Emily Carter's service record or her professional conduct, I will answer them personally. If anyone in this administration has paperwork placing her on leave pending an investigation," he let the words sit, I would strongly suggest reviewing whether that paperwork is something you want to be associated with in the next 24 hours. Gerald Garfield arrived in the emergency department 4 minutes later, which told Emily that someone had called him the moment the three generals walked through the doors, and that he had come down personally rather than sending a representative, which told her that he had understood immediately that this required his presence. He was breathing slightly faster than normal when he appeared in the doorway, and he was carrying nothing, which meant he hadn't stopped at his office. He looked at the generals. He looked at Emily. He looked at the bruise on Emily's jaw with the expression of a man suddenly and clearly seeing the object he had been diplomatically not looking at for the past 18 hours. "Ms. Carter," he said, we need to talk." "Gerald," Emily said, "this is General Kellerman. He and his colleagues would like to speak with hospital administration about last night's incident." Garfield looked at Kellerman the way you looked at a thing that was larger than you'd expected. "Of course," Garfield said. "Of course. We can use the second-floor conference room." "That works," Kellerman said. They went upstairs. Emily did not go with them. She had not been invited and had not asked, because she understood that what was happening in that conference room was not her fight to fight. It was a different kind of fight, conducted in a different register, by people who had spent careers moving through institutional structures and understood exactly which pressure points produced which responses. She went to Bay 6 instead. Sasha Moreno was awake, sitting up slightly against the raised head of the bed, with a tablet in her lap and a straw and a cup of apple juice. Her oxygen sat was reading 97 on the monitor. Her color was better. She looked, for the first time since Emily had met her, like a 7-year-old who was thinking about something other than how much effort it took to breathe. Rosa was in the chair, on her phone, and looked up when Emily came in. Her eyes went immediately to the bruise. "They told me what's happening," Rosa said, "downstairs. People are talking." "People are always talking," Emily said. She looked at the monitor, checked the rate, noted the improved sat. "How'd she do overnight?" "Better. She slept 4 hours in a row. That hasn't happened since she was admitted." Emily nodded. She looked at Sasha, who was looking back at her with the focused attention children deployed when they were trying to figure out whether an adult was okay. "Your face looks worse," Sasha said. "It looks worse before it looks better. That's how bruises work." Sasha considered this. "My mom says you should put arnica on it." "Your mom is probably right." "She's always right," Sasha said, with the tone of someone reporting a fact that was both true and slightly inconvenient. "She's right about everything." Rosa smiled without looking up from her phone, the automatic smile of a parent who has heard this particular assessment before. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, which she did not normally do, but which felt right now like the correct thing. She checked the oxygen clip on Sasha's finger, repositioned it slightly. "How does your chest feel?" "Like a chest," Sasha said. "That's the best answer you could have given me." Upstairs, the conference room meeting lasted 40 minutes. Emily knew this because Kellerman texted her at 2:47 to tell her they were done, and she had been in the department since just after 1. She didn't know the specific content of those 40 minutes and didn't ask, because Kellerman would tell her what she needed to know and would edit out what he judged she didn't. And after 22 years of intermittent contact, she had made her peace with the fact that this was how he operated. What she learned, in pieces, over the following hour, was this. The administrative leave paperwork had been rescinded. Not suspended, rescinded. A distinction Kellerman apparently made clear was not optional. Patricia Ames had called Garfield's office during the meeting to inquire about the hospital's position going forward, and Garfield had told her, with 3 retired generals seated across from him and a video with 2 million views running on someone's laptop at one end of the table, that the hospital's position was that the incident was under review and that the hospital supported its staff. He had used the phrase regrettable situation 4 times, which Emily thought was probably a personal record for him. The video she learned from Ronaldo, who was tracking it with the enthusiasm of someone watching a sports event unfold in real time, had crossed 2 million views at around noon and was now at 3.4 and climbing. Major news networks had picked it up. The clip was running on cable news with lower thirds identifying Marcus Holt by name, his company, his net worth. Someone in the comments section had pulled public records on Holt Meridian Defense Corporation and compiled a thread that was being shared separately from the video itself. A thread that included the IG referral history and the names of the procurement officers and a timeline of the contract irregularities going back to 2017. The internet, as Strom had observed at the Waffle House, was doing the work. What the internet did not know, what nobody outside a specific set of federal agencies knew, was that at 3:18 p.m., a convoy of vehicles that were not marked with any agency identification pulled up to the Meridian headquarters building on Commerce Street and disgorged approximately 20 individuals who were, based on their bearing and their equipment and their very specific way of moving through a building lobby, not there for a routine visit. Emily learned this from Pharaoh, who called her at 3:22. "It started," he said. "She was standing in the corridor outside Bay 6. "How is it going?" "Cleanly so far. Their security team was smart enough to step back. We're in the server room." A pause, and in the background she could hear sounds that were office sounds. Voices, doors, the specific acoustic texture of a large open-plan workspace that had gone suddenly quiet. "There's more here than we expected, which is saying something, because we expected a lot." "What kind of more?" "The kind that adds names to lists." Another pause. "Emily, the procurement officer I mentioned, the one who didn't retire. I remember. He was at this office today, voluntarily, which means he came here knowing the investigation was moving, which means someone warned him, which means there's a communication chain we're now inside of." His voice stayed flat. "That's a significant find. Is he talking?" "He will be," Pharaoh said, and left it there. She stood in the corridor after he hung up, thinking about procurement officers and communication chains and the specific weight of a 9-year fraud structure beginning to give way under its own accumulated evidence. She thought about a contract worth $4.3 billion that had been built on falsified specifications and kickbacks and political insulation, and about the fact that none of that had been visible 20 hours ago, and that what had made it visible was one man's decision to raise his hand in a public space and believe he wouldn't have to answer for it. She went back to check on Dale Pruitt, who was being discharged and was still annoyed about the esophageal spasm diagnosis, and wanted to argue about whether it could actually feel that much like a heart attack, to which Emily said yes, it absolutely could, and to which Dale said that seemed like a design flaw in the human body, to which Emily said she agreed but the body hadn't consulted her on the specifications. He laughed at that, which pulled at his chest, which made him grimace, which made her check his discharge vitals one more time just to be certain. He was fine. He left at 3:45 with a prescription and a sheet of dietary guidelines he was probably not going to follow. At 4:10, the news broke publicly. Ronaldo was the one who saw it first, because Ronaldo had been monitoring 4 different news feeds on his personal phone for most of the afternoon, and he said, loudly enough for the entire department to hear, Oh, that's... Okay, that's happening." Emily looked up from the station. "FBI and IG joint operation at Meridian headquarters," Ronaldo said, reading from his screen. "They're saying Marcus Holt was taken into federal custody at," he checked, 3:58 p.m. He looked up. His expression was the expression of a 26-year-old who has just watched an abstract concept, consequences, make contact with a specific reality. "He's in custody." The department absorbed this. Carly said quietly, "Good." The attending, Dr. Ferris, who had been charting at the far end of the station, set down his pen. He looked at Emily with the expression he'd had earlier, the one that contained shame, and said, "Emily, for what it's worth, last night I should have—" "You were managing a septic patient," Emily said. "That's not—" "You were managing a septic patient, David. You did your job." She looked at him steadily. "That's what we're all doing here." He picked up his pen, looked at it, put it down again. "I should have come out sooner." She didn't tell him he was wrong, because he wasn't. But she also didn't give him the absolution he was reaching for, because some things needed to sit with a person a while before they became useful. She let the statement stand and moved on. The next 2 hours were strange, in the way that hours after large events were strange. full of the same tasks as always, the same vital checks and medication rounds and charting and patient questions, but overlaid with a different quality of attention. People move through the department with the slight heightened awareness of those who understand they are inside a story while it is still happening, unsure of their role in it, but conscious of the role's existence. Kellerman found Emily at 5:30 near the elevator bank, which was the least populated section of the floor at that hour. "Strom is heading back to Washington tonight," he said. "Abe is staying until tomorrow. I'm not sure yet." "You don't need to stay, James?" "I know I don't need to." He looked at her face, the bruise. "How bad is the pain?" "Manageable." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He looked back. This was a dynamic they had established a long time ago, in different circumstances, and it had survived enough years to be durable. "It hurts," she said. "It'll hurt less in a few days." He nodded. "There's going to be a lot of attention coming. Media. Probably official inquiries. DOD will want to talk to you about the timeline, about what happened before you made the call. There will be people who want to make you into a symbol." "I'm a nurse," Emily said. "You're also a Navy Cross recipient who was assaulted on camera in a way that triggered a federal investigation that has been waiting 9 years for a detonator." He said it without drama. "Both things are true. The question is how you want to navigate the space between them." "The same way I've been navigating it," Emily said, "by going to work." He was quiet a moment. Not because he disagreed, she could tell he didn't, but because he was doing the thing he always did, which was processing the full implications of a statement before responding to it. "Okay," he said finally, "that works, if you're prepared for what that looks like with a news crew outside the parking lot." "Is there a news crew outside the parking lot?" "2," he said. Abe counted. She exhaled through her nose. "I'll use the side entrance." He almost smiled. Almost. "There's something else." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held for a moment before handing it to her. "This came through official channels this afternoon. It's not classified. You can keep it." She unfolded it. It was a letter. Official DOD letterhead, the specific kind that came out of the office that managed the records of decorated personnel. 2 paragraphs. The substance of it was that certain records pertaining to her service, previously held under restricted access as a matter of operational security, were being reviewed for declassification in light of recent developments. The letter used the phrase, "in recognition of exemplary service," twice. She read it twice. "What does this mean practically?" she said. "It means your file is being opened," Kellerman said. "The full file. Not the summary that personnel records show, but the actual file. The deployments, the citations, the action in Kandahar and the others before and after it." He paused. "It means the next time someone in that building decides to characterize you as a nurse who caused a problem, there will be a public record that tells a different story." Emily refolded the paper carefully along its original creases. "I didn't ask for this." "No," he agreed. "You asked for someone to know what happened. The rest of this is consequence, not intention." He looked at her. "You know how those work." She did. She had spent enough of her career operating inside chains of consequence, actions taken in one context producing effects in another, effects producing further effects, the whole system operating according to its own logic regardless of what any individual inside it intended, to understand that intention and consequence were related but distinct categories. She folded the letter and put it in her scrub pocket. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "Don't thank me," Kellerman said. "Thank me by not letting anyone in that building treat you like what you were yesterday, which is what they'll try to do again once the news cycle moves on. Because it will move on, Emily. It always does." "I know." "Make sure it leaves something behind when it goes." She was going to answer that when her pager went off. "Basics, Sasha Moreno." She was moving before Kellerman finished his next sentence, down the corridor at the specific pace that was not quite running. Running in a hospital announced panic to patients and families, which was operationally counterproductive, but covered ground faster than it appeared to. She pushed through the bay door and took in the room in the first second. Rosa standing, phone dropped, face reading acute distress. Sasha upright in the bed with her shoulders pulled high and forward, the specific posture of someone whose airway was working harder than it should, the oxygen monitor reading 88 and descending. Emily was at the bedside before the number reached 87. What happened? She was already reaching for the oxygen mask, trading out the nasal cannula. When did this start? 2 minutes ago, Rosa said. She was fine, she was talking, and then she said her chest felt tight, and I called, Sasha. Emily fitted the mask, checked the seal. Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Small fingers closed around hers, weak but present. Good girl. I need you to breathe with me, slow, in through your nose. She modeled it, even through the mask's muffling. That's it, slow. She hit the call button with her elbow. Carly appeared in the doorway. Emily said, without turning, Get Ferris, now, and I need a bronchodilator on the cart and a BiPAP setup. She looked at the monitor. 87, still descending. And call respiratory about, tell them I need them here in 3 minutes, not 5. Carly was gone. Emily kept her hand in Sasha's and watched the number and maintained the breathing rhythm with her voice. Steady, low, the voice she had used in very different contexts for injured people in very different places. The voice that said without words, I am not panicking, so you don't have to panic, so just breathe with me, just breathe. The number stopped at 85. Then slowly, too slowly for comfort, but moving in the right direction, it began to climb. Dr. Ferris arrived at a near run, read the monitor, read Emily's face, and said, What's her history say about reactive airway, viral trigger? This is the 3rd episode this admission. Emily kept her eyes on Sasha. She responded to bronchodilator last time in about 4 minutes. I need to know if we want to stay the course or if you want to intubate now while she still has margin. It was not a simple question. Intubation in a 7-year-old with reactive airway disease carried its own risks. Waiting carried different risks. The margin between the two was currently reading 85 and climbing toward 86. Ferris looked at the child, at the monitor, at Emily. Bronchodilator first, 2 minutes. If we're not seeing response by then, we intubate. Agreed. The next 2 minutes were the specific variety of long that had nothing to do with clock time. Emily administered the bronchodilator and maintained the mask seal and spoke to Sasha in a low, continuous voice. Not full sentences, just sounds that meant I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, while the monitor climbed from 86 to 87 to 88, and paused at 88 for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then moved to 89. Rosa was standing at the foot of the bed, with both hands pressed flat on the bed rail, not speaking, barely breathing herself. 90. 91. Ferris exhaled audibly. There she goes, he said. 93. Sasha's shoulders dropped, the specific physical release of a body that has been bracing against the effort of breathing and has just felt that effort ease. Her eyes, above the mask, found Emily's. Emily squeezed her hand once. The monitor reached 94 and held. Good, Emily said. You're good, Sasha. Nice work. The respiratory therapist arrived 90 seconds later, which was late but within a range Emily could accept, and took over the monitoring while Emily stepped back and gave Ferris room to do the post-event assessment. She moved to the corner of the bay and wrote the response time and the intervention in her mental chart and noted that the episode had resolved faster than the previous one, which was information that meant something about Sasha's trajectory and was mostly good information, though the fact of a 3rd episode meant they needed a pulmonology consult before discharge. She was still standing in the corner when Rosa looked at her across the bay. Rosa's eyes were wet. Not crying, not quite, but close. Thank you, she said. Emily nodded. It was all she did. At 6:45, Ronaldo found Emily at the supply station and held out his phone wordlessly. On the screen was a live news feed, a reporter standing outside a federal building, the chyron reading Holt Meridian CEO arrested. Federal fraud charges. Behind the reporter, visible through the building's glass entrance, were figures moving with the specific purposeful energy of federal processing. In the upper corner of the screen, a small inset box was still running the video. The ER. The slap. Emily walking back to her patient. Ronaldo said, They're saying preliminary charges include wire fraud, procurement fraud, and one count of conspiracy. He paused. They're also saying there's a sealed count that they're not releasing yet. Emily looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she handed the phone back. I need you to restock the mass supply in Bay 4, she said. We burned through most of it this afternoon. Ronaldo looked at her. That's... Emily, that's it? That's your reaction? She was already moving toward Bay 4. That's it, she said. What she did not tell him, what she did not say to anyone in the department that evening, was what she had felt in the 2 minutes while Sasha Moreno's oxygen number had hovered at 85 and the bronchodilator worked through the child's system, and Emily had held a 7-year-old's hand and watched a monitor and spoken words that meant, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. She had not thought about Marcus Holt. She had not thought about the video, or the generals, or the letter in her scrub pocket with the DoD letterhead, or the federal agents in the Meridian building on Commerce Street, or the sealed indictment count that nobody was releasing yet. She had thought about the number on the monitor. She had thought about the hand in hers. She had thought, breathe. And across the city, in a federal holding facility that had not been designed for men of Marcus Holt's net worth or self-assessment, a man who had built a $4 billion architecture of fraud and insulation and political protection sat in a room that contained exactly one chair and one table and no window, and began to understand for the first time in 9 years that the architecture had developed a crack he had not seen coming, in a place he had not been watching, in the form of a nurse who had refused to let his son cut the line. The door to the holding room opened. A federal attorney walked in and set a document on the table. The document was 47 pages long. Mr. Holt, the attorney said, let's talk about the sealed count. The sealed count was obstruction, not the ordinary kind, not a panicked executive shredding documents on a Thursday afternoon when he heard footsteps in the lobby. The obstruction charge that the federal attorney set in front of Marcus Holt at 6:52 p.m. was the kind that had been built carefully over time by someone who understood exactly which levers to pull inside a federal investigation to make it move slower than it should. Witness interference, document suppression routed through shell entities. 2 separate instances of what the charging document described as coordinated communication with federal employees for the purpose of impeding active review, which was the legal language for bribing people inside the agencies that were supposed to be watching him. Holt read the first page. He turned to page 2. The attorney sat across from him and did not speak, because the document was designed to do the speaking, and because men like this attorney had learned that silence in a room with a 47-page charging document was more effective than any supplementary commentary they could provide. On page 7, Holt found a name he recognized. On page 9, he found another. By page 12, he had found 4 names of people he had paid in various configurations of cash and contract and career advancement to ensure that certain investigations remained slow and certain referrals remained unfiled and certain reviewers remained unconvinced. He put the document down. I want my attorney, he said. Your attorney is currently in a separate room reviewing a related document, the federal attorney said. She'll be available to you shortly. Holt looked at the man across the table with the specific expression of someone reassessing a situation they thought they had contained. How long have you had this? Which part? Holt said nothing. Mr. Holt? The attorney folded his hands on the table. The investigation you're looking at has been active in various forms since 2019. What happened yesterday at Rivergate Regional Medical Center did not create this case. It created the public visibility that made it politically untenable to continue managing the timeline. He paused. You made yourself the story. Once you were the story, everything attached to you became the story. That's not a legal strategy. That's a media dynamic. And I'm afraid it's no longer something we can help you control. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to page 13 of Peter Rose. Emily's shift ended at 7, which was when the day caught up with her. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way exhaustion after sustained adrenaline always happened, in pieces, each piece arriving with a slight delay from the event that caused it, the body's bookkeeping catching up to the ledger. She was standing at the central station completing her end-of-shift chart documentation when she noticed that her right hand, holding the stylus, had developed a faint tremor, not visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She was looking for it. She finished the chart, she set the stylus down. She pressed her palm flat against the counter for a moment and felt the tremor move through it and dissipate. The night shift nurse, a man named Terry, who had been at Rivergate for 6 years and had a specific talent for appearing at the right moment without being summoned, materialized beside her with a water bottle and set it on the counter without comment. He had that quality, an awareness of what people needed that didn't require them to ask for it. "Good handoff," he said. "Sasha in Bay 6 had a third bronchospasm event at 5:10, Emily said. "She's stable, SAT is 95, but she needs a palm consult before discharge. I've already put the note in." "Got it." Dale Pruitt went home. Margaret Voss is being transferred to ortho in the morning. She ran through the rest of the board in 90 seconds. The specific compression of information transfer that happened at shift change, the whole shape of a person's medical situation reduced to its essential facts. Then she picked up the water bottle. "It's yours, Terry." "I know." He looked at her face, the bruise, and then away, which was the correct thing to do. "Go home, Emily." She went. The side entrance, as Kellerman had suggested, and he had been right about the news crews. There were now 3 vehicles with satellite dishes in the main parking lot, and 2 reporters doing stand-ups in front of the building's entrance with the Rivergate sign visible in the background. She could hear one of them, faintly, as she crossed toward her car. The nurse at the center of what has rapidly become a national story, while inside Federal Holding, Marcus Holt, the CEO of defense contractor Holt Meridian, faces a growing list of charges. She got in her car and sat for a moment with the door closed and the engine off. Her phone had 43 missed notifications. She didn't look at any of them. She drove home. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Maps on the kitchen table, good coffee maker on the counter, the particular silence of a space that had been empty all day and was adjusting to occupation. She set her bag by the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment, doing nothing in particular, which was something she was not practiced at. She made coffee she didn't need and stood at the kitchen counter drinking it. Her phone buzzed. Kellerman. "Strom's back in D.C. Abe and I are at the hotel. Call if you need anything tonight." She typed back, "I'm fine, thank you." A pause. Then, "I know you're fine. Call anyway if it changes." She set the phone down. The coffee was too hot and she drank it anyway because the heat was grounding and because she needed something to do with her hands. She thought about the 47-page document in a federal holding room. She thought about Pharaoh's voice saying there's more here than we expected. She thought about Sasha Moreno's hand closing around hers at 85% oxygen saturation, weak but present, which was the only data point from the day that she could look at directly without it costing her anything. The rest of it she was going to have to look at sideways for a while. She was on her second cup when her phone rang. Unknown number, which twice in the same day meant something different than it usually did. She answered. "Ms. Carter." Female voice, familiar. The reporter. "Lords," from the Nashville Herald. "I'm sorry to call again. I know you said, 'How did you get my number the first time?'" Emily said. A pause. "I have a source inside Rivergate administration." "Who?" "I can't tell you that, but I want to. Ms. Lords, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly. And if you don't answer it honestly, I'm going to hang up." A brief pause. "Okay. How long have you been working the Meridian story specifically? Not adjacent to it. The Meridian procurement fraud specifically." The pause this time was longer. 14 months. Emily sat with that. 14 months was not a reporter chasing a news cycle. 14 months was an investigation. And you couldn't publish. "I had sources but not documents, and the sources were nervous. They'd been nervous for a long time." A pause. "Yesterday changed that." "How many sources?" 4. One of them is a former procurement officer." A careful pause. "He came to me voluntarily this afternoon after the raid. He wants to talk on record." Emily set down the coffee cup. "He was at the Meridian office today." Silence on the other end, then, "How do you know that?" "I know," Emily said. "What's his name?" "I can't give you that yet." "Lords?" She kept her voice level. "I'm not going to interfere with your story. I'm not going to interfere with his decision about what he says and to whom. I'm asking because there are federal investigators who need to know he's talking to press before he talks to press. Because if he says the wrong thing in the wrong order, it affects the evidentiary chain. She paused. You know that. Another silence, a longer one. His name is Gareth Poole, Lord said, former GS-14 in procurement oversight. He retired 8 months ago, or was retired. The distinction matters. Emily wrote the name on the back of an envelope on the counter. Then she sent it to Pharaoh's number as a text with no context. Pharaoh's response came back in under 2 minutes, a single word, confirmed, which meant they already knew, which meant Poole had either already made contact with the federal team or was already under some form of monitoring, which meant Lord's story was either going to be extraordinarily well-sourced or was going to be complicated by the criminal proceedings in ways that would require navigation. Ms. Lords, Emily said, I'll talk to you. Not tonight. Not on the record about anything involving the federal case. But the other thing, what happened at the hospital, what I saw in that administration meeting, the pattern of how institutional power protects itself when someone with money applies pressure, that I can talk about. A pause that had a different quality than the previous ones. When? Call me in 3 days. If nothing has changed in the case, we'll set something up. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for another moment, then went to bed at 9:15, which was earlier than she'd slept in months, and was asleep before 9:30, which was not something she'd done since she couldn't remember when. The next 72 hours moved the way the hours after large events always moved, faster in aggregate than they felt in the living of them, each individual moment slow and granular, the overall passage compressed by the density of what was happening. Holt Meridian's board convened an emergency session at 8 a.m. the following morning and voted to remove Marcus Holt as CEO, pending the resolution of the criminal proceedings, which was the corporate equivalent of abandoning a burning structure. Efficient, self-interested, and not particularly dignified. The board's statement used the phrase full cooperation with federal authorities 4 times and mentioned Holt by name exactly once in the sentence that announced his removal. Sylvia Pratt issued a statement on his behalf describing the charges as politically motivated and factually unsupported, which was the legal equivalent of a holding pattern, something to say in public while figuring out what could actually be defended in court. The answer, as the federal team continued working through the Meridian servers, was becoming increasingly not much. Pharaoh updated Emily on the second morning with a call that lasted 8 minutes and covered more ground than most conversations 3 times its length. The server pull is still in progress, he said, but what's already in review covers 9 years of contract documentation. The material substitution alone, just the equipment submitted as meeting spec that didn't, covers at least 14 separate defense contracts. We're talking about body armor components, vehicle armor plating, communications equipment, field use equipment. His voice stayed flat, but there was something underneath it that wasn't flatness. Some of it was deployed. Emily was quiet. We don't have casualty correlation yet, Pharaoh said. That's going to be a separate investigation, and it's going to take time. And I'm not telling you it's going to produce what you might think it produces, because causation in those scenarios is complicated. A pause. But the possibility is there, and the people working this case are aware of the possibility. She stood at her kitchen window looking at the street below, which was doing what streets did on a Wednesday morning. Cars, a woman walking a dog, the particular ordinary texture of a city that had not noticed that its own ordinary texture was currently adjacent to something it would read about in newspapers. What's the timeline for charges, she said. Grand jury is being convened. 3 weeks, possibly less. The sealed count, the obstruction, is already filed. The fraud counts are in formal preparation. A pause. Holt's attorney is in the process of exploring whether a cooperation agreement is possible. Is it? That depends on what he has to offer, Pharaoh said, and who he's willing to name. She thought about page 7 of the 47-page document, the name she hadn't seen but that Holt had read on his way to page 12. He has names. He has names, Pharaoh confirmed. Whether he uses them is a different question. Men like Holt spend their careers in a system where cooperation is for other people. Recalibrating that belief while sitting in federal custody is not always a smooth process. Nothing about this has been smooth, Emily said. No, he agreed. but it's moving. She went back to work on Thursday. The news crews were gone from the main parking lot, which she had expected. The story had moved, literally, from the hospital to the federal courthouse and the Meridian building and the ongoing coverage of the investigation. And the physical location of Emily Carter was no longer the most visually interesting component of the narrative. She used the main entrance, which felt like a reclamation of something small, but not nothing. Doris was at the intake desk. She looked at Emily when she came through the doors, looked at the bruise, yellowing now at the edges, which was improvement, and said without preamble, "Bay assignments are backed up. Triage has 4 waiting." "Good morning to you too, Doris," Emily said. "Good morning. 4 waiting." Emily clocked in and picked up the first chart. The day had the quality of a return to something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Not comfort exactly, because the ER was rarely comfortable, but purpose. The specific purposefulness of work that was real and immediate and had clear parameters for success. A patient presented a problem. You assessed it. You intervened. The monitor told you what was happening. These were knowable things, responsive things, things that didn't require 47-page documents or 11-digit codes or 3 generals in a Waffle House parking lot. She was halfway through the morning when Carly came to find her. "Sasha's family is asking if you're here," Carly said. "She's being transferred to the pediatric floor for the palm consult." Her mom asked specifically. Emily finished the blood draw she was in the middle of. A 70-year-old man with a possible PE who was being very calm about the situation, which she appreciated, got the sample labeled and bagged and went to Bay 6. Sasha was dressed, which was the most significant indicator of improved status possible in a pediatric patient. Dressed meant going somewhere, and going somewhere in a hospital always meant better. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in a purple shirt with a dinosaur on it, and she looked at Emily when she came in with the expression of a child who has decided something. "I made you something," she said. She produced, from beside her on the bed, a folded piece of paper. Emily took it and opened it. Inside was a drawing in crayon, a figure in blue scrubs with yellow hair, and beside the figure another figure in a hospital bed, and above both figures what appeared to be a sun, but might have been something else. "That's you," Sasha said, pointing to the scrubs figure. "And that's me. And that's..." She pointed to the circular shape above them both. "A heart, because you have a big one." Emily looked at the drawing. Rosa, from the doorway, said quietly, "She worked on it this morning. Wouldn't let me see it until it was done." Emily folded the drawing along its creases and put it in her scrub pocket next to the DOD letter that she'd been carrying since Tuesday and hadn't decided what to do with yet. She looked at Sasha. "You're going to the 4th floor for a little while, so some doctors can listen to your lungs." "I know," Sasha said. "Mom told me. They're very good at what they do. And when you leave this hospital, which is going to happen, it's not an if, it's a when. I want you to come back and tell me what your lungs sound like." Sasha considered this proposal with the seriousness it deserved. "Okay," she said. "Good." Rosa touched Emily's arm as she turned to go. Brief, warm, the particular touch of a person who doesn't have the right words and has stopped looking for them. Emily nodded. Then she went back to the PE patient with the test results. On Friday, Sylvia Pratt issued a revised statement on Holt's behalf. The revision was significant. The language about politically motivated charges was gone. In its place was a single paragraph that acknowledged certain accounting irregularities in Holt Meridian's federal contract reporting, expressed deep regret for any impact on the integrity of the defense procurement process, and noted that Mr. Holt was engaged in productive dialogue with federal investigators regarding the full scope of relevant information. Productive dialogue meant he was talking. Farrow called Emily at noon to confirm what the statement's careful language implied. "He gave them 2 names this morning," Farrow said. "Senate Armed Services Subcommittee staff. Not members, staff. But the staff in question had access that explained several things about how the IG referrals stayed cold." "Are those names going to be charged?" "Under investigation." A pause. "Emily, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information rather than as..." He seemed to search for the word absolution. "Go ahead." "The network Holt built, The people he paid, the procedures he corrupted, the oversight he neutralized. It's larger than we initially assessed. What we're looking at now is not one company's fraud. It's a procurement corruption structure that involves at minimum 9 individuals across 3 agencies and 2 congressional offices. He paused. This is not what a single slap in an emergency room usually produces. I know, Emily said. I'm not saying you caused this, Farrow said. I'm saying you were the thing that was in the way when the dam had already been building pressure for 9 years. The dam was going to break. You were just in the way, Emily said. Yeah, something that might have been the beginning of a laugh moved through his voice and didn't quite complete itself. In the way. She hung up and went back to her patient. Well, the story, as Kellerman had predicted, began to move on by the weekend. Not away. The federal case would produce coverage for months. The grand jury process alone would keep Holt's name in the news cycle through the summer. But the specific intense attention focused on Emily Carter and Rivergate Regional Medical Center began to diffuse, spreading outward into the larger story of the investigation, which was where it belonged. She was still receiving interview requests, 17 of them by Saturday morning, ranging from local affiliates to cable news to a podcast she'd never heard of that described itself as covering institutional accountability. She declined all of them except one, which was Diane Lords at the Nashville Herald. And that conversation happened on Saturday afternoon in a coffee shop in East Nashville and lasted 90 minutes and covered exactly what Emily had said it would cover: the hospital, the administration meeting, the pattern of institutional protection, the paperwork that had appeared under the break room door. Lords was good at her job. She asked precise questions and let the answers breathe without pushing them toward the shape she wanted. Emily respected that enough to be more candid than she'd planned to be. The article ran Sunday morning. It did not lead with the assault. It led with the administrative leave paperwork, a copy of which Lords had obtained from her source inside the hospital, still unnamed, though Emily had her suspicions. And it built from there: the specific mechanics of institutional self-protection, the way liability management functioned as a replacement for ethical decision-making, the documented attempt to characterize a workplace assault as a behavioral concern on the part of the person assaulted. It used Emily's name and quoted her twice, both times on process rather than on personal experience. It was precise and accurate, and it was going to make Gerald Garfield's Monday morning significantly worse than his Friday afternoon, which Emily thought was probably appropriate. She read it with her first cup of coffee, then set her phone down and went to the pull-up bar in the bedroom doorway and did 15 reps, which was 3 fewer than her usual morning set, because her shoulder was still telling her what it thought about the tension she'd been carrying for the past 4 days. She did 15 anyway. The shoulder would adjust. Monday brought 2 things. The first was a formal letter from Rivergate Regional Medical Center, delivered to her home address via courier on hospital letterhead, signed by Gerald Garfield and by the board chairperson, a woman named Helen Trask, who Emily had never met. The letter described the events of the previous week as deeply troubling, acknowledged that the administrative leave paperwork had been issued in error under significant external pressure, expressed the hospital's unreserved support for Ms. Carter's continued service, and announced the creation of a staff protection review board to examine the processes by which external parties may improperly influence employment decisions. She read it 3 times, looking for the parts that were real and the parts that were legal cover, and found both in approximately equal measure. The apology was genuine enough, in the way that apologies issued under public pressure could be genuine. Not the whole truth, but not entirely false either. A man trying to navigate between what he had done and what he needed it to look like he had done. She filed it in the kitchen drawer where she kept important documents and forgot about it within the hour. The second thing was a phone call from Farrow at 11 a.m. Bryce Holt came forward, Farrow said. She stopped moving. She was halfway between the kitchen and the living room, and she stopped. Marcus Holt's son. Yes. He contacted federal investigators voluntarily on Sunday evening. He's 22, he has his own attorney, and that attorney has apparently been advising him since Thursday. A pause. He was present for conversations between his father and at least one of the Senate staffers. He was in the room. He says he understood what he was hearing. Emily was quiet. He's 22, she said again. Yes. And he watched his father hit a nurse because she wouldn't let him skip a line, and then he watched the whole week happen, and now he's in a federal attorney's office. That's approximately correct. She thought about the young man she had seen in the emergency department, pale, sweating, cradling his arm, looking like someone who wanted to be somewhere else. A kid who had grown up inside a system built by his father and had perhaps only just, in the past week, begun to see the system's actual shape. Is his cooperation going to be useful? She said. Significantly, Pharaoh said. He's a first-hand witness to at least 3 conversations that connect his father directly to the obstruction count. With his testimony, the cooperation agreement Holt's attorneys are exploring becomes considerably less attractive because the case is stronger without it. Meaning Holt can't buy his way to a lighter charge by giving up names. Not as easily, not with his son already in the room. Emily leaned against the doorframe. The son isn't going to be charged? He was a minor for most of the relevant period. The conversations he witnessed, the ones he's prepared to describe, he was 17 to 20 for those. He's being treated as a witness. A pause. Emily, there's one more thing. Say it. Bryce Holt also provided a statement about the incident at Rivergate Regional. Specifically, he provided a statement indicating that his father had, in the 20 minutes before entering the emergency department, received a phone call from his attorney advising him that the IG inquiry into Meridian was becoming active again and that Holt had been, in Bryce's description, already angry before they got out of the car. The corridor outside Bay 6, the way Holt had walked in, the quality of his anger, not situational, not the anger of a frustrated father, but something already present, looking for a surface to land on. He wasn't angry about the wait, Emily said. He was angry about the investigation, Pharaoh said. The wait was available. She stood in the doorway for a long moment after the call ended, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about a man who had received news that his 9-year architecture of fraud was developing pressure, who had walked into a public hospital and struck the nearest available person because the anger needed somewhere to go, and she had been in the way. She thought about the fact that if Sasha Moreno had not been coding in Bay 6, if Emily had not been at the central station at that specific moment, if the line had been shorter, or the wait faster, or any of 100 other small variables had been different, the surface available to Holt's anger would have been someone else entirely. She thought about how easily it could have been Carly, or Doris, or Ronaldo, or any of the people who worked that floor every day without 11-digit codes or files that were being reviewed for declassification. She thought about that for a while. Then she picked up her bag, because she was due at the hospital in 40 minutes, and she went. She was charting at the central station at 2 p.m. when Terry, who was finishing a double shift and looked it, came and stood beside her. "There's a woman on the 4th floor asking about you," he said. "Rosa Moreno. Says Sasha had her palm consult this morning and wanted to send something down." Emily looked up. "The kid made you another drawing," Terry said. "Apparently the first one wasn't enough." Emily logged out of her chart, walked to the elevator, rode it to the 4th floor, and found Rosa outside room 412 in the corridor, holding a folded piece of paper. "She made me promise to give it to you personally," Rosa said. She was very specific about that. Emily took the paper and opened it. This one was more ambitious than the first. More figures, more color. The crayon strokes bolder, the composition more deliberate in the way that a child's art became more deliberate when they were feeling better and had more energy to put into it. There was the Scrubs figure again, blue, yellow hair. There was the hospital, rendered as a large rectangle with many windows. There were 3 large figures beside the hospital that Emily studied for a moment before recognizing. Large, in what appeared to be dark clothing with small gold shapes on the shoulders, standing in a row. "She saw it on the news," Rosa said, reading Emily's expression. "The generals. She saw them come in. She told me she wanted to draw everyone who was there." Emily looked at the 3 large figures. Kellerman would be amused, she thought. Wentworth would say the proportions were off. In the center of the drawing, between the Scrubs figure and the row of generals, Sasha had drawn something that Emily had to look at for a moment to identify. A small green shape, roughly cup-shaped, with a rough oval beside it, and a figure smaller than all the others holding the cup toward the Scrubs figure. A cup of Jell-O. Emily stood in the 4th floor corridor of Rivergate Regional Medical Center with 2 crayon drawings in her hand, one in each, and felt something that moved through her chest and didn't quite resolve into anything nameable, which was the way the real things usually felt, in her experience. Not clean, not simple, not the shape you expected them to be. "She's going to be okay?" Emily said. "The pulmonologist says her baseline is better than the admission presentation suggested," Rosa said. "The episodes were triggered by a viral infection that's resolving. He thinks with the right maintenance regimen, she can avoid hospitalization for future flare-ups." She paused. "He said whoever managed her acute care did a good job." "She did the hard part," Emily said. Rosa looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 4 days watching someone work and had formed a clear assessment. "You know what I noticed about you from the first night?" Emily waited. "You never once looked at her like she was a problem to be solved," Rosa said. "Every doctor who came in, I'm not criticizing, I understand how it works, but they'd look at the chart first. You looked at her first." Emily didn't have a response to that, so she didn't make one. She folded both drawings carefully, slid them into her scrub pocket alongside the letter with DOD letterhead, and took the elevator back down to the emergency department, where the afternoon board was filling up, and Terry was trying to hand off to the incoming shift, and 3 people in the waiting area needed triage assessment. She clocked back in. At that same moment, in a federal courthouse 2 miles away, a grand jury was receiving its first formal briefing on the case of United States versus Marcus Allen Holt, and the prosecutor leading the briefing was explaining to 23 citizens who had been asked to give up their Thursday afternoons why the case they were about to review was going to require their attention for the next several weeks, and why the charges being considered were not, despite what some public commentary had suggested, primarily about what had happened in a hospital emergency room. The prosecutor was explaining that the hospital was where it became visible. What it was, she explained, was something that had been happening for 9 years to people who never got to sit in a courtroom and hear their names mentioned in places that didn't have news crews in the parking lot. She set a photograph on the table in front of the grand jurors. The photograph showed body armor. Specifically, it showed body armor that had been submitted under contract as meeting a ballistic resistance standard and had, upon independent testing, failed that standard at a rate that the materials engineer whose report was in the packet before them had described in his professional assessment as not marginal, categorically insufficient. The room was quiet. The prosecutor let it be quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Let's talk about what Marcus Holt sold to the United States military, and what the United States military paid for, and what the difference between those two things cost." The grand jury took 11 days. That was faster than the federal prosecutor had projected, and faster than Sylvia Pratt had been hoping for, and faster than the legal analysts who had been dissecting the case on cable news every evening had predicted. 11 days of testimony, document review, and deliberation, and then a formal indictment on 19 counts that was filed on a Tuesday morning and made public by noon. Emily was in Bay 3 when she found out, managing a 44-year-old woman named Constance Reeves, who had come in with chest pain that turned out to be a NSTEMI, a non-ST elevation heart attack, the quieter kind, the kind that didn't announce itself with the dramatic EKG changes that made diagnoses straightforward, and instead required clinical attention and pattern recognition and the specific willingness to treat what you suspected rather than waiting for confirmation that arrived too late. She had the IV line in and the heparin running and was waiting on cardiology when Ronaldo came to the bay doorway with his phone in his hand. She looked at him. He held up the screen. The headline was clear from 4 feet away. Holt Meridian CEO indicted on 19 counts. Fraud, obstruction, conspiracy. She looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Constance Reeves, who was watching the exchange with the alert attention of a woman who had just been told she was having a heart attack and had decided the most useful thing she could do was pay close attention to everything around her. "Is that about the nurse?" Constance said. She had a voice that suggested she had spent decades in a profession requiring directness. A teacher, Emily thought, or a manager of some kind. "Yes," Emily said. "Good," Constance said. And then, "Now, can someone tell me what heparin actually does? Because they didn't explain it properly at intake, and I prefer to understand what's going into my body." Emily explained what heparin did. The trial date was set for 8 weeks out, which was aggressive for federal court and indicated, according to the legal analysts, that the government's case was considered strong enough that a prolonged pretrial period was seen as more risk than benefit. The defense filed 4 motions in the first 2 weeks: change of venue, suppression of server evidence, dismissal of 2 counts on procedural grounds, and a challenge to the admissibility of Bryce Holt's testimony on the basis of a claimed privilege that the presiding judge, a woman named the Honorable Diane Marsh, disposed of in a written ruling of 11 pages that Farrow described to Emily on the phone as efficient. Efficient how? Emily asked. She took each argument, gave it exactly as much consideration as it warranted, and explained in plain language why it didn't work, Farrow said. Defense counsel is going to have a difficult 8 weeks. Emily was in her kitchen, on her day off, doing something she rarely did, which was nothing in particular. She had a cup of coffee and the window and the street below, and she had been standing there for 20 minutes watching the city move through its morning without requiring anything from her. Are they going to call me? She said. At trial. As a witness to the assault, potentially. The assault itself is part of the obstruction narrative. Specifically, the attempt by Holt's legal team to suppress your complaint and influence the hospital administration's response is part of the obstruction count. A pause. But Emily, the trial is not going to be about you. You'll be at most one witness among many. The case is built on 9 years of financial documentation and the testimony of 6 cooperating witnesses. You are the event that made it visible. You are not the case. I know, she said. I wanted to say it anyway. She looked out the window. Farrow, the body armor. A silence. The independent testing report, she said. The one in the grand jury materials. Do they know? Is there any? There's a parallel investigation, he said. DOD, Inspector General, separate track. It's going to take considerably longer than the criminal case. Causation analysis in that kind of review is, he paused, slow, and often inconclusive. The variables are substantial. But it's happening. It's happening, he confirmed. She stood with that for a moment, the window, the street, a man walking a dog that appeared to be mostly ears. Okay, she said. Okay, he said, and hung up. The weeks before the trial had a particular quality that Emily had not anticipated. Not dramatic, not tense in the way she would have expected, but instead strangely ordinary, the way life after crisis usually settled. She worked her shifts. She checked vitals and managed IV lines and talked to frightened people at 2 a.m. when the fear was loudest and the explanations most necessary. She ate lunch in the break room and argued with Terry about whether the coffee maker needed to be replaced, and attended the first meeting of the Staff Protection Review Board that Garfield had announced, which turned out to be more substantive than she'd expected, possibly because Helen Trask, the board chairperson, had apparently decided that the reputational damage of the past month required actual structural change, rather than a committee that met twice and produced a report nobody read. Emily sat in that meeting for 2 hours and said almost nothing, and came away with the specific impression that something real might happen, which was a more optimistic assessment than she'd arrived with. She also, on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks before the trial date, drove to a park on the east side of the city where Rosa Moreno had texted her that she brought Sasha every week, and she sat on a bench and watched a 7-year-old girl run across a field in purple sneakers, breathing without difficulty, chasing a soccer ball with the specific full-body commitment of a child who had recently been reminded that running was possible. Rosa sat beside her on the bench. Pulmonologist says she's doing better than projected, Rosa said. I can see that, Emily said. Sasha had noticed her arrival and was now running toward the bench with the soccer ball tucked under her arm and an expression of focused delight that Emily found unexpectedly difficult to look at directly. You came, Sasha said. I said I would. People say that, Sasha said, with the philosophical weight of a 7-year-old who had spent enough time in hospitals to have calibrated her expectations. I know, Emily said. I came anyway. Sasha dropped the ball and sat on the bench beside Emily, which put her approximately at Emily's shoulder level, and looked up at her with the specific scrutiny children deployed when they were forming a serious assessment. "Your face is better," she said, "almost all the way." "Does it still hurt?" "Not much." Sasha nodded, apparently satisfied with this report, and then looked at the field and then back at Emily. "Are you going to court?" "Where did you hear about court?" "My mom watches the news," Sasha said, in the tone of someone explaining an unavoidable fact of life. "I might have to go talk to a judge," Emily said. "It's part of how things get resolved." "And then the bad man goes to jail?" Emily looked at her. "That's what happens when a jury decides someone did something wrong. Yes." Sasha considered this. "Good," she said, and picked up the ball and ran back onto the field, apparently having completed the conversation to her satisfaction. Rosa watched her go. "She asked me if you were going to be okay," she said, "about 2 weeks after she was discharged. Out of nowhere, at dinner, just, 'Mom, is the nurse going to be okay?'" Emily kept her eyes on the field. "I told her yes," Rosa said. "I hope that was accurate." "It was accurate," Emily said. The trial began on a Monday. Emily drove to the federal courthouse alone, which was how she had decided she wanted to arrive. Not with Kellerman, who had offered, not with Wentworth, who had also offered, but in her own car, in the clothes she had chosen, on her own schedule. She wore a dark blazer over a gray shirt and the kind of flat shoes she'd learned to prefer in the Corps, and she had done nothing particular with her hair, which by now had grown out slightly from the precise cut she usually kept, and had entered a middle stage that she hadn't decided what to do with. She was not testifying today. Today was opening statements. She sat in the gallery, third row, left side, where she could see both the defense table and the jury without craning her neck, and watched Marcus Holt take his seat beside Sylvia Pratt at the defense table. She had not seen him in person since the emergency department. He looked smaller than she remembered, which she recognized as a perceptual effect rather than a physical one. In the ER, he had filled the space because he had expected to, and expectation had a way of manufacturing presence. In a federal courtroom, where the architecture was designed to make individuals feel appropriately modest about their place in the proceedings, the expectation didn't hold. He was just a man in a gray suit at a wooden table, and he looked like what he was, someone who had made choices and arrived at their terminus. He did not look at the gallery. She noticed that. His eyes stayed on the table, on his attorney, on the judge's bench, anywhere that was not the rows of faces behind him. She thought about what Pharaoh had said, "You are not the case." She thought about it and found that it felt true. Sitting in this gallery, watching the procedural machinery of federal prosecution begin its process, she felt not distant from it, not uninvested, but correctly placed, not at the center, not the point. Present, witness, the person who had been in a specific corridor at a specific time, and what had happened there had mattered, and that mattering had produced this, and that was a chain of events she could trace without needing to be at the end of it. The prosecutor stood. Her name was Assistant U.S. Attorney Constance Briggs, and she was 48 years old and had spent 22 years in federal prosecution, and she had the quality of a person who had long since stopped needing to perform authority and simply exercised it. She stood at the podium and looked at the jury and said, "This case is about a choice. Not one choice, many choices, made over 9 years by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway, because he had built a system that allowed him to believe the choices would never cost him anything." She paused. He was wrong about that. Emily testified on the 4th day. She had been prepared for it, in the technical sense. The AUSA's office had spent 2 sessions with her covering the scope of her testimony, what would be asked, what the defense would likely challenge, how to answer questions that were designed to be confusing without becoming defensive. She had listened and asked her own questions and gone away with a clear picture of the shape of what was coming. She was not prepared for the specific experience of walking into that courtroom and sitting in the witness chair and looking at the jury. 12 people, ranged in age from what appeared to be mid-20s to late 60s, diverse in the specific demographic way of a Nashville jury pool, and understanding that what she said in the next hour would be part of a permanent record. She was not afraid of that. She was aware of it, which was different. Briggs walked her through the night in sequence: the arrival, the triage situation, the refusal, the assault. Emily answered each question in the same register she used for patient handoffs: precise, sequenced, neither minimized nor amplified. She described the impact: the blood on her lip, the two-finger check. She described walking to Bay 6. "Why did you go back to your patient?" Briggs asked. Emily looked at her. "Because she needed me there." "You had just been struck across the face." "Yes." "You weren't in shock? You didn't feel you needed a moment to—" "I knew what I'd need to address later," Emily said. Sasha Moreno was 7 years old, and her oxygen saturation was dropping. That was the immediate problem. Briggs nodded. "And did you report the assault that evening?" "I reported it to charge nursing and attended a meeting with hospital administration." "And what was the outcome of that meeting?" "I was asked to take administrative leave." "As the assault victim?" "As the assault victim, yes." A silence in the courtroom that had a specific texture. Not dramatic, just the quiet of people absorbing the plain statement of a plain fact. The cross-examination took 30 minutes and accomplished very little, because the defense's strategy with Emily, she could see it immediately, was to minimize rather than challenge. To suggest she had misread the situation. To introduce the possibility that the strike had been reactive rather than deliberate. That the context of a frightened father and a refused request had produced a moment of poor judgment rather than an act of contempt. She answered each question the same way, directly, without elaboration, without the defensive color that witnesses sometimes added when they felt they were being maneuvered. "Ms. Carter," defense counsel said, a man named Adler, precise and measured, who had clearly understood that attacking her directly would be counterproductive. "Isn't it possible that Mr. Holt was simply a man under considerable stress that evening, reacting in a way he deeply regrets?" Emily looked at him. "He said, 'Know your place,'" she said. "After. That's not a reaction. That's a position." The courtroom was quiet again. Adler moved on. The trial lasted 18 days. 6 cooperating witnesses, 47 exhibits, 3 expert testimonies on procurement standards, materials testing, and financial fraud structure. The testimony of Gareth Poole, former GS-14, who described on the stand 3 separate meetings in which he had received what he characterized as career guidance from individuals connected to Holt Meridian, guidance that had corresponded precisely with the deceleration of IG referral activity. The testimony of Bryce Holt, who was 22 years old and looked it, sitting in the witness chair with the specific visible discomfort of someone doing something they knew was necessary and hadn't found a way to make comfortable, describing a phone call he had heard in a car outside Rivergate Regional Medical Center on a Tuesday evening, his father's voice, tight with a specific anger that Bryce described, without theatrical elaboration, as the way he sounded when he thought something was getting away from him. Sylvia Pratt was good at her job and worked with what she had, which was not enough. The financial documentation was extensive. The cooperating witnesses were specific. The body armor testing report had been admitted into evidence, and the materials engineer who had produced it had explained in methodical detail, accessible to 12 non-specialists, what the difference between the submitted specification and the actual performance meant in practical terms. She did the best she could with the closing argument, humanizing, contextualizing, raising reasonable doubt in every cavity she could find. But the structure was too well built, and the foundation had been under construction for too long, and in the end she was arguing against a record rather than a narrative, and records were harder to reframe than stories. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Emily was not in the courthouse when the verdict came. She was at Rivergate Regional Medical Center, in the middle of a shift, and she found out the way everyone in the department found out. From Ronaldo, who had his phone on silent but was monitoring the news feed, and who appeared in the medication room doorway at 3:17 p.m. and held up his phone screen. Guilty. All 19 counts. She read the screen. Then she went back to the patient she had been preparing discharge paperwork for, a 60-year-old man named Frank Okafor, who had come in with an infected laceration on his right forearm and was being sent home with oral antibiotics and wound care instructions. "Hold still," she said, finishing the wound dressing. "Sorry," Frank said. "You okay?" You look like you just heard something. I'm fine, she said. You need to change this dressing every 12 hours. I put the instructions in your paperwork, but I'll tell you again. Clean it with the saline solution, pat dry, new dressing. If you see increased redness spreading beyond this margin. She drew a light line on his skin with a marker. Come back. Don't wait. Okay, Frank said. But you sure you're okay? She looked at him. Guilty on all 19 counts, she said. Frank looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the dressing on his arm. Then he looked back up. The Holt thing, he said. Yes. Frank nodded slowly, with the considered nod of a man processing good news that had been a long time coming. All right then, he said. She handed him his discharge paperwork. Sentencing was 6 weeks later. She did not attend the sentencing hearing. She had thought about it and decided against it. Not from indifference, but because attendance would have required her to want something specific from the proceeding, and she had spent considerable time examining whether she wanted anything and had arrived at an answer that surprised her. Not much. The verdict was the resolution. The specific number of years was the court's arithmetic, not hers. Farrow called her afterward. 22 years, he said. Federal sentencing guidelines, 19 counts, with the obstruction enhancement adding substantially to the base. A pause. No parole in federal. He serves 85% minimum. She did the math. Holt was 53. The corporate assets have been frozen pending civil forfeiture proceedings, Farrow continued. Meridian's federal contracts, all of them, are terminated. The company itself is under a court-appointed receiver and will almost certainly be dissolved within the year. The 2 Senate staffers named in the obstruction count were indicted separately last week. You may have seen that. I saw it. Poole has entered a cooperation agreement. No prison time, significant civil penalties, 5 years supervised release. The IG's parallel investigation into the body armor contracts is ongoing. He stopped. There's one more thing. She waited. Bryce Holt, Farrow said. He's been accepted to a pre-nursing program at a community college in Knoxville. He contacted me last week, not about the case. The case is done for him, but to ask if I knew how to reach you. A pause. He wanted me to tell you he was sorry. That was the whole message. I told him I'd pass it along. Emily stood in her kitchen, in the particular afternoon light that came through the west window at this hour, and held the phone and thought about a 22-year-old with a fractured arm in an emergency department waiting room doing the math on his own life. Tell him I got the message, she said. Already did. 3 months after the verdict, Rivergate Regional Medical Center convened what Gerald Garfield called an all-staff recognition event, which was a phrase that made Emily immediately suspicious. She attended because Deb Nguyen, who had come out of retirement for the occasion on the grounds that she had been charge nurse during the incident, and therefore had standing, told her that if she didn't attend, Deb would park outside her apartment until she did, which Emily believed. The event was in the hospital's main conference room, which was too small for the number of people who tried to attend. There were chairs in rows and people standing along the walls, and Emily was in the 3rd row between Ronaldo and Terry, and was aware, from the moment she sat down, that she did not particularly want whatever was about to happen. Garfield spoke first. He was better than she'd expected. Not performative, not defensive, not reaching for language that sanitized what he'd done. He stood at the front of the room and said that the administrative leave paperwork had been a failure of leadership under pressure and that he took personal responsibility for it. And he said it without qualifiers, which she noticed and credited him for. He also announced that the Staff Protection Review Board had produced a formal policy, now ratified by the hospital board, requiring independent review of any employment action taken against a staff member within 30 days of an incident involving a patient or family member, with a mandatory third-party advocate for the staff member in question. It was an actual policy, with teeth. She had read it the week before when Trask had sent it for comment. She had sent back 2 suggested amendments, and both had been incorporated. Then Garfield said her name and looked at her, and she stood, because the room clearly expected her to stand, and she stood in the 3rd row between Ronaldo and Terry with the particular self-consciousness of someone who was deeply uncomfortable being the object of collective attention and waited for it to be over. It was not immediately over. Kellerman was there. She had known he would be. He had told her he was coming, and she had told him it wasn't necessary, and he had said he was coming anyway. He stood at the front of the room and said things about Kandahar that Emily had not heard said in public before, and she sat with that. The strangeness of hearing the private made public, the story told in a room of people who knew her only as a nurse, the recontextualization of 8 months of daily proximity. She watched their faces. Carly, who had put her hand over her mouth on the day the generals walked in. Doris, who had retained the expression of someone being confirmed in a long-held assessment. Ronaldo, beside her, looking at Kellerman with an expression she couldn't read, but that had something of awe in it, and something else that was more personal, less definable. Dr. Ferris, in the second row, was looking at the floor. Wentworth spoke briefly, which was characteristic. He said, "When someone saves your life, you carry the debt. We're here because we've been carrying it for 22 years, and we wanted the people who work beside her every day to know what she's worth." Emily thought she was going to be fine until he said that. She was not entirely fine after that. She pressed her jaw together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was a technique she had used in various situations over the years to manage physical responses to emotional stimuli, and it worked with about 70% effectiveness, which had to be sufficient. Then they asked if she wanted to say anything. She had not prepared anything. She had deliberately not prepared anything because preparation would have required her to decide in advance what she thought, and she had not been sure until this moment what she thought. She stood up. She looked at the room, at the people she worked with, the nurses and techs and attending physicians and the volunteers and the administrative staff, and the people she knew by shift pattern and by quirk and by the specific way they handled a bad night. And she said, "I want to say something about what this job is, because I think it got lost in the coverage." She paused. "Every person in this room has done the same thing I did. Gone back to the patient. Every shift. Under conditions that were harder than they should have been, with resources that were fewer than they needed to be, in situations that nobody was fully prepared for." She looked at the room. "What happened to me was visible because there was a camera and a billionaire. What happens in this building every day is invisible because there isn't. That doesn't make it less." She stopped for a moment. "Nobody wearing scrubs should ever be made to feel like they don't matter. Not by a patient's family member, and not by the institution they work for, and not by a system that decides they're replaceable when they become inconvenient." She looked at Garfield briefly, directly, not with hostility, but with the particular clarity of a statement being made to the right person. "That's not something I want on a plaque. I want it in policy. I want it in practice. I want it in how this building treats the next person who gets into a conflict with someone who thinks their money entitles them to something it doesn't." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Deb Nguyen from the back wall said, "Amen," in the tone of a woman who had been waiting for someone to say the thing and was pleased that it had finally been said. She drove home alone, which was how she'd arrived, and she sat in her parked car in front of her building for a few minutes before going up. She thought about Marcus Holt, who was at a federal correctional facility now, being processed into a system designed to be indifferent to the distinctions that had organized his previous life. She thought about Bryce, who was in Knoxville, learning how to read a patient chart. She thought about Gareth Poole, who had walked into a federal building on a Tuesday afternoon because something had finally become too heavy to carry in silence. She thought about the body armor report, and the parallel investigation moving slowly through its variables, and the people it concerned who would never sit in a gallery or read a headline. She thought about Sasha Moreno running across a park field in purple sneakers, not thinking about breathing, not needing to think about breathing, just running. She got out of the car and went upstairs. The maps were still on the kitchen table, the abandoned project she'd never gotten back to. She stood over them for a moment, then picked them up, not to discard them, but to move them to the shelf, because she needed the table clear for something she had decided this afternoon she was actually going to do. She had been asked by the nursing school at a local university 3 weeks earlier whether she would consider teaching a guest seminar on triage decision-making and crisis assessment. She had said she would think about it. She had thought about it with the fraction of her attention she allowed for things that were not the immediate problem,
and she had been thinking about Deb's voice the day Emily had walked out of the administration meeting. Don't let them make it so the quiet was for nothing. She sat down at the cleared table and opened her laptop. She had never written a curriculum before. She had taught, in the field, in the specific improvised way of a medic instructing soldiers how to pack a wound while the situation was ongoing. But formal curriculum was different. It required the knowledge to be organized not for the moment, but for transfer, built to survive being handed to someone who hadn't been there, who hadn't carried it, who needed to find it useful in a context she couldn't predict. She started writing. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, which was the longest she'd sat at a desk for a non-administrative purpose in years. The first section was on prioritization under constraint, how you decided, when everything was urgent, what was most urgent, and how you made that decision quickly enough to be useful while carefully enough to be right. The second was on de-escalation in a clinical environment, which was a topic she had substantial practical material on, some of which had acquired recent illustrative value. She paused at that section, then she kept writing. The third section was harder because it was about the thing that nursing training rarely addressed directly: what you did when the institution failed you. When the system that was supposed to support the work instead put pressure on it. When the decision wasn't purely clinical but political, and the patient in front of you was both the most important thing in the room and the leverage someone else was trying to use against you. She wrote, "The job doesn't stop because the environment is hostile, but you're allowed to know that it's hostile. You're allowed to name it. The naming is not the same as the job failing. Sometimes the naming is the job working exactly as it should." She looked at that sentence for a long time. She left it in. She was back at work the next morning at 7. The board had 4 patients already. Doris handed her a chart at the desk. A 58-year-old man named Gregory Whitfield presenting with shortness of breath and diaphoresis, which was a combination that required immediate attention. And she took the chart and moved to triage and began doing what she had been doing since she was 23 years old, in different clothes in a different country. The same fundamental act in different form, moving toward the problem, assessing it, deciding what it needed, providing that thing as precisely and quickly as she could. The monitor showed his oxygen at 93%, which was not critical but was trending. His pulse was elevated. His skin was clammy, and his color was wrong in the specific way that cardiac presentations were wrong, the grayish undertone that the body produced when it was working too hard to maintain its own circulation. "Mr. Whitfield," Emily said, attaching the leads, "I need you to tell me when the shortness of breath started." "This morning," he said, "but I've been tired for a week. I thought it was a cold." "Has the tiredness been constant, or does it come and go?" "Comes and goes. Worse when I walk upstairs." She noted that. Effort-induced, episodic, progressive over a week. That was information with a shape. "Have you had any chest pain, even mild, even something you dismissed?" He hesitated. The hesitation was information too. "There was something," he said, 2 days ago. I thought it was heartburn." "Okay," she said. "We're going to run an EKG and some labs, and I'm going to have the cardiologist come look at you. I need you to stay still and let the monitor do its job." "Is it serious?" he said. She looked at him, at his face, at the specific quality of his attention, the way he was holding himself as if bracing for an answer he'd been delaying asking for. "I think we caught it early," she said. "That's the best case right now. Let's make sure it's true." He nodded. His hands on the bed rail unclenched slightly. She called for the EKG tech and moved to the next chart, because there was always a next chart, because that was what this work was. Not a series of dramatic moments strung together, but the accumulation of thousands of ordinary ones, the showing up, the paying attention, the decision made correctly in the unglamorous middle of a Tuesday morning when nobody was watching and nothing was being recorded, and the 7-year-old wasn't in the bed and there were no generals in the doorway, and the only thing present was a sick person and a nurse who had decided, a long time ago and again every morning, that this was where she was going to stand. She stood there. Outside the hospital, the city moved through its mourning. The federal case was in post-conviction proceedings that would work through their calendar without her. The policy changes at Rivergate were being implemented in increments, imperfectly, with the friction that all institutional change carried. Bryce Holt was in a classroom somewhere, learning to read a pulse.
Sasha Moreno was in school, probably, with adequate lung function and a drawer somewhere that contained 2 hospital drawings she would either keep or not, would either remember or fold into the ordinary texture of growing up. The world had not been fixed. The work had not ended. The system that had tried to push her out still had the shape it had always had, still contained the pressures and incentives and defensive reflexes that had produced that particular Tuesday evening and would produce others. She knew that. She had never expected otherwise. What had changed was smaller than a revolution and larger than it appeared from the outside. 19 counts. Guilty. Everyone. A policy with teeth in a building she worked in. A curriculum beginning to exist on a laptop on a kitchen table. A woman who had been told, in the language of paperwork and institutional silence, and one very loud act of contempt, that she did not matter, who had never once believed it, not for a single minute, not in the supply closet, or the conference room, or the 4th-floor corridor, or the witness chair. Walking into an emergency department on a Wednesday morning and picking up the first chart of the day. The monitor beeped. She looked at it, adjusted Gregory Whitfield's lead placement by 2 millimeters, and waited for the clean read. It came. She noted the result, flagged the abnormality that was there and had been there, wrote it into the chart in clear language that the cardiologist would not have to interpret, and moved. There was work to do, there always was, and she had never once needed someone to tell her it was worth doing.